Honorable members, before from this document, which I've had circulated almost every budget debate, and I quote, it says on parliamentary expressions, proprietary and decency and good taste require that a member should not use ironical, derogatory, or unbecoming words of expression while speaking. There are certain words and expressions that have been held to be unparliamentary or objectionable or otherwise not in good taste, such as blackmailers, black marketers, buffoons, bullies, cheats, monkeys, monsters, scoundrels, rogues. So I don't want to go on and on. So please, could we follow the example set by the Honorable Minister of Human Services and Social Security or earlier in this debate that seemed to have brought back a lot of respect in the House and for the House. With this, our Hansard division is still looking at the transcript of the last few minutes of the speech by the Honorable Member, Ms. Hughes. As soon as I get that, I will deal with it. There are two things we're looking at there, ashamed and the type of reference used to a former member of staff of the Ministry of Education. With this, Honorable Member, I now invite the Honorable Member, Mr. Roysdale Ford, to make his Roysdale Ford Senior Counsel to make his contribution at 2:23.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for permitting me this afternoon to make my contribution to this debate. Mr. Speaker, I rise to join the members of the National Assembly on this side of the House in the examination and dissection of the 2022 estimates and expenditure. But Mr. Speaker, the last presentation before we broke for lunch was delivered by the Honorable Nigel Dharamlal. Mr. Speaker, his presentation epitomizes the problems of this government. Mr. Speaker, like a broken pencil, his presentation is without a point. Mr. Speaker, whilst his presentation was being delivered by the Honorable Member, on social media, one Kurt Campbell commented on its content. And I'll just say 4 words from it, Mr. Speaker. You make me sick. Mr. Speaker, the budget presentation by the Honorable Senior Minister, Dr. Ashley Singh, is a budget that will make this nation sick. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Nigel Dharamlal spent some time speaking about credible leaders and credible leadership. But Mr. Speaker, the track record of this government and the track record of that honorable member has been one that would have made parents sick in this country, in the hinterland regions, would have made children sick, would have made daughters sick. Mr. Speaker, the budget presentation delivered by the senior minister in the office of the president with responsibility for finance is entitled Steadfast Against All Challenges, Resolute in Building Our One Guyana. This budget fails to provide a blueprint for a better Guyana and an equitable distribution of the resources and is short on substance. The budget unashamedly skews the opportunity to the few and increases the burden on the many. Mr. Speaker, the citizens have witnessed and experienced a rapid deterioration of the social and economic conditions over the last year, propelling and significantly worsening the economic and social decay of the country has been the inept, abysmal handling of the worst public health crisis of our country has experienced in a century. the evidence of the incompetence and the degree of risk that the People's Progressive Party constitutes in relation to the welfare and well-being of the Guyanese people can be gleaned from the dreadful reports of poor care of COVID-19 patients at medical institutions, the acquisition of vaccines not approved by the World Health Organization, the alarming spread of the virus throughout the country, the lax enforcement of COVID-19 guidelines, and most of all, the staggering number of deaths and the pain and loss, grief, and broken families left in its wake. Whilst the Guyanese people were left to meander this dreadful existence, the People's Progressive Party and my friends on the other side fettered and exhaled in Dubai. The mismanagement of the COVID-19 crisis affected the educational sector. Over 1,000 public pupils, according to the Ministry of Education, dropped out of school by August 2021. The cost of living, according to the Bureau of Statistics, has increased by 14% for the first 7 months of 2021. The Bureau of Statistics have also informed that general living costs increased by 5.4%. This increase in food prices has affected poverty levels, household income, and children's schooling. This has increased the burden of the family, particularly many parents, single-parent families led by women. Women and children are therefore disproportionately affected by the high cost of living. Mr. Speaker, these are the challenges that the Guyanese people face. These are the challenges that the Guyanese people will face after this budget. There are no solutions to these challenges in this budget. Mr. Speaker, like the previous budgets presented by the senior minister in this, the 12th Parliament, this budget goes further in ensuring, guaranteeing, and cementing the building of one Guyana of the haves and one Guyana of the have-nots. Perhaps the single and most pervasive and devastating hardship which has been imposed on the Guyanese people since the installation of the People's Progressive Party has been the backward, offensive, harsh, and cruel economic policies and the consequences of such policies. The consequences of the incompetent policies of the People's Progressive Party and the refusal to adopt the Village Renewal Program as proposed by the Trade Union Congress will be the inability of the population in the villages and rural areas to cope with the ever-increasing high cost of living, rising inflation, rising unemployment levels, hunger and social ills, increased use of alcohol, drugs, more crime and suicide, unstable families, and the vulnerabilities of the aged, women, and children. The Guyana Trade Unions Congress recommended to this regime that $25 million be set aside for 70 villages for job creation, poultry rearing, cash crops, cattle rearing, computer training, dressmaking, and similar activities. This would have cost about 1/3 of 1% of the budget, Mr. Speaker. We in the Partnership of National Unity and the Alliance to Change support this call. And as a government, we will have made this disbursement to the benefit of the people of Guyana. Mr. Speaker, the government is oppressive, heartless, and insensitive. The reality is that the Guyanese people are punishing. The People's Progressive Party and Irfan Ali are cruel and insensitive. Let us examine.
Honorable member, you will have to withdraw that comment about His Excellency President.
Let us examine what was the real income of the Guyanese labor force in 2021. Mr. Speaker, the nominal monthly income can be gleaned from the Guyana Labor Force Survey, which is published quarterly by the Bureau of Statistics. At the end of the second quarter of 2021, the salaried workers, whether public or private sector, received around $94,810 monthly, and that of the self-employed was reported as $71,681. The pre-budget figures were adjusted for the 7% increase of the last quarter of 2021, which would be for salaried workers in the public sector, raising it to $101,446.70. But the government gave a 7% increase to the salaried public servants. But the net effect, Mr. Speaker, was a 5% increase in disposable income after NIS and taxes. This increase was applied to all incomes on the assumption that the government and the private sector pay the same wages. And I am being generous, Mr. Speaker, because the private sector wages are not necessarily better than the public sector wages. Before the 2022 budget, the salaried workers had about 1,168 Guyana dollars per month to live on after buying food and paying and keep a roof over their heads. For a household of 4, that meant that each person had a real income of $9.73, or US 5 cents to live on for each day. The circumstances of the self-employed were more desperate, for they did not even have enough money to buy food or keep a roof over their heads. Mr. Speaker, the 2022 budget has changed nothing. The increase in the tax exemption raised to $75,000 per month in 2022 budget has resulted in a monthly disposable income of the salaried worker of $90,574. It does not change for the self-employed. This meant that salary workers got an increase in real income of 2,617 Guyana dollars. This translates into $21.29, or about 6 US cents per day for each member of a family of 4. The net change from the pre-budget income is $10 yuan. $10, Mr. Speaker, or 2 US cents per day. Again, the self-employed is left in a horrible position. Mr. Speaker, this is therefore nothing than a $10 budget, a US 2 cents budget. This is nothing more than a US 2 cents budget for a household of 4. This economy, Mr. Speaker, is not working for the ordinary people of Guyana. Despite the regime's effort to place its hand on the Natural Resource Fund and to spend monies in the Natural Resource Fund without identifying its specific purpose, it is clear that it is not meant to improve the lives of the Guyanese people. Mr. Speaker, it is also manifest that it is not being spent to reduce poverty. In a budget of $556 billion, of which $126 billion came from the Natural Resource Fund, all the average family has received is a $10 coin, the equivalent of US 2 cents per day. Is this the family, Mr. Speaker, that is now in possession of this $10 coin, that can buy a car to drive on those highways to which this budget alludes? Is it this family, Mr. Speaker, that is now in possession of a $10 coin that must benefit from the $15 million mortgage arrangement that this budget alludes? These families, Mr. Speaker, with the extra $10 are left behind and left out. These families are unable to comfortably pay basic bills, purchase basic food items. They're unable to live a basic lifestyle. They're unable to provide basic amenities for the children. They're unable to save for the future. This budget leaves these families to stand steadfastly alone against these challenges. These families are left to fend for themselves. This budget, Mr. Speaker, is wholly anti-family. This budget, Mr. Speaker, has given the small man nothing, nothing to survive on, nothing to live on, nothing to hope for. Mr. Speaker, I spoke of how earlier disconnected these people are from reality, and I've had occasion to draw to this House attention. In paragraph 6.7 of the budget speech, the minister stated, and I quote, "We gave a commitment to reverse the punitive taxes that were implemented by the APNU AFC once we returned to office. One such tax that was implemented was a 2% withholding tax on resident contractors," end of quote. Even though we use the word implemented, Mr. Speaker, this would potentially convey the impression that by this statement, that the tax was the creation of the APNU AFC. I just want the people of this country to know that this issue came into being in 1996, and to emphasize their intentions, the PPP updated it in 2003. They're behaving as if the also onerous VAT was the creation of the APNU AFC. The PPPC created a 16% VAT. The APNU AFC reduced it to 14%. Let me make it clear, Mr. Speaker, that we of our Partnership for National Unity AFC will remove the personal income tax altogether. We want the Guyanese people to be in control of their lives and not the government. The proper way you can invest and take care of your family in the context of this country today, Mr. Speaker, is by the removal of the personal income tax. The proper way to control inflation is to remove the personal income tax so to allow the Guyanese people to invest and produce more goods and services for this country. Mr. Speaker, last year, the Guyana Trade Unions Congress specifically requested that careful attention be paid to the National Insurance Scheme. This year, they've repeated that request again. Again, Mr. Speaker, no attention has been paid to the National Insurance Scheme. The regime has failed to invest in the National Insurance Scheme over the years it had previously been in office. As a matter of priority, Mr. Speaker, the monies in the Natural Resource Fund should have been allocated to a truly national institution, the National Insurance Scheme. The senior minister was the chairman of the Cooperative Finances Administration, which had to approve investments made by the National Insurance Scheme and did improve those investments of over $6 billion in the Colonial Life Insurance Company, CLICO. Mr. Speaker, the senior minister was the Minister of Finance who had responsibility for the National Insurance Scheme, and he allowed the funds of the National Insurance Scheme to be plundered. The investment failed, leaving beneficiaries of the National Insurance Scheme suffering terribly. Mr. Speaker,
Honorable member, you're now imputing that the senior minister of finance who presented this budget allowed for the plundering of the National Insurance Scheme, right? I wouldn't allow that.
He presided over it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the senior minister should consider it his moral and legal responsibility to ensure that the National Insurance Scheme receives the necessary and required funds from the Natural Resource Fund, which would guarantee the long-term viability of the National Insurance Scheme. Mr. Speaker, the National Insurance Scheme is critical to the long-term welfare of the Guyanese people. The senior minister himself at paragraph 4.216 of the budget speech stated, and I quote, "The scheme faces serious challenges regarding its long-term viability," end of quote. This budget is still steadfast against all challenges, but the budget has absolutely provided no solution to this challenge. We of the Partnership of National Unity understand that among the challenges facing the Guyanese people and the working people of Guyana is the weakened National Insurance Scheme, as weakened and plundered by this government. Under the Partnership of National Unity, the funds in the National Resource Fund would have been used to eliminate the deficiencies in the scheme, to strengthen the scheme, and to provide improved benefits for the Guyanese people. The strengthening of the NIS scheme by our party, Mr. Speaker, would have represented a continuation of our commitment to the working people of Guyana, as evidenced by our signing in September 2016 of a debenture of over $5.6 billion to repay the National Insurance Scheme for the losses suffered in 2009 under the PPPC when the Colonial Life Insurance Company collapsed. Mr. Speaker, the senior minister, paragraph 4.214 of the budget speech, stated that at the end of 2020, the regime mandated the board to address the long-standing administrative problems, and that much has been achieved since then. Mr. Speaker, what has been achieved since then is the continuation of the plunder of the scheme. What has been achieved since then, Mr. Speaker, has been the allocation of resources to mothers and families of members of the PPP sitting government who would have been entitled and receiving monies for which they do not have the necessary contributions, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Honorable member, am I hearing you correctly that people are getting contributions that are not qualified for it? That's what. Could you produce the evidence to me, please?
Mr. Speaker, I undertake the latest Monday morning to produce the documentation which would indicate, Mr. Speaker, that $1.5 million, almost $2 million, would have been paid to the mother of a member of the government. She did not have the necessary contributions. The NIS board met and decided illegally, in my view, to still make that payment, Mr. Speaker. And I produce it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
Again, illegally, in your view, and now the action of the board who can represent themselves here, right, is called into question. Monday, you'll present the particular reference for me, please.
Mr. Speaker, the statement that the governance architecture of the senior minister regime is, I quote, is based firmly on inclusivity, participation, accountability, and rule of law is a glaring example of the fundamental diversion from reality and truth. Since the installation of the People's Progressive Party on the 2nd of August 2020, Guyana has descended into a state of disarray. Guyana is currently an undemocratic, oppressive petro republic. Mr. Speaker, while the regime has for propaganda purposes clearly dubbed and referred to this country as the Dubai of the Caribbean, it has publicly embraced Kazakhstan as the model of governance. Mr. Speaker, this budget is designed to replicate the Kazakhstan model. Mr. Speaker, like in Kazakhstan, the People's Progressive Party's civic, governance, and economic policies have seen accelerated inflation, poor access to public services, a small wealthy elite, income inequality, and economic hardships. The Guyanese people are under attack by a series of labor violations, which are aimed at the working people who have perceived to be supporters of the opposition and trade unions that represent these workers. Mr. Speaker, the senior minister's regime has a sordid track record of failing to engage in consultations and in rejecting inclusivity and accountability. Mr. Speaker, whilst the failure to consult is a characteristic of this regime, this budget is seminal, Mr. Speaker, in its signification of a lack of consultation, both in its process and its content. I say this, Mr. Speaker, because this budget is being financed by funds in the Natural Resource Fund. The Natural Resource Fund has been raided and looted, Mr. Speaker, by this regime as a result of a bill.
I cannot allow raiding and looting, right?
Mr. Speaker, the Natural Resource Fund has been pillaged. The funds have been acquired, depleted, taken under acquisition by a process that is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. As a result of the bill purportedly passed with virtually no notice and no consultation. Mr. Speaker, the regime has refused to meet with the Guyana Public Service Union as required by the Extant Collective Labor Agreement between the union and the government. This regime has refused to grant livable wages and salaries for the public service and attendant agencies and organizations. They refuse to engage in consultation with the Guyana Teachers Union. They refuse to grant livable wages for the teachers and for allowances for additional qualification for teachers. They refuse to constitute, Mr. Speaker, the police, the public, judicial, and teaching service commissions. The life of the Teaching Service Commission has expired in February 2021. The consequence of this, Mr. Speaker, is that no teacher can be promoted. Legitimate expectations of promotion are dashed. After the most recent industrial action undertaken by teachers in response to the oppressive COVID-19 guidelines imposed by this regime, the regime unilaterally withdrew from a provision in the collective labor agreement which established a committee comprising of representatives of the Teachers Union and the Ministry of Education to identify suitable teachers to be recipients of scholarships and duty-free concessions. Mr. Speaker, this regime has promoted and encouraged the partisan functioning of the Trade Union Recognition and Certification Board. In respect of the Trade Union Recognition and Certification Board, the regime has supported an illegal election and the subsequent issuance of a certificate of recognition from the Union of Agricultural and Allied Workers Union to the regime-associated Guyana Agricultural and Workers Union. They have terminated the recognition agreement between Sirius Taxi and the Guyana Bauxite and General Workers Union, Mr. Speaker. This regime refuses to cause the Minister of Labour, Kokoko Joe, to bring the Bauxite Company and the General Bauxite Union and the General Workers Union together to address the issue of the incorrect calculation of workers' termination payments. Mr. Speaker, the rule of law, Mr. Speaker, is itself under attack by this regime. One of the major features of any PPP civic party governance, Mr. Speaker, in this country has always been extrajudicial killings. Whilst the president in September last year denied that extrajudicial killings had ever taken place under any PPP.
I'll cut you again there with references to His Excellency, the President.
Mr. Speaker, whilst the President, the former Minister of Housing, in September last year would have denied that extrajudicial killings had ever occurred under PPPC regime, the facts are well known, well documented, and point to the contrary. Between August 2020 and the present time, the following persons were extrajudicially killed: Sherwin Philly, the 29th of January 2021, Peter Headley, the 11th of May 2021, or in Boston, the 15th of September 2021. Mr. Speaker, the very act of extrajudicial killings would be contrary to the Constitution of Guyana, its spirit and its ethos. Article 197(a)(4) of the Constitution states that the police force established under the Police Act shall function in accordance with law as a law enforcement agency of the state, responding to the daily needs to maintain order by suppressing crime, to ensure citizens are safe in their homes, the streets, and other places, end of quote. Rather than the Guyana Police Force protecting Orrin Boston safely in his house, the Guyana Police Force, by its officers, shot and killed him in his home.
Mr. Speaker, the member is speaking about a matter that is sub judice. The matter is in court. There are proceedings filed in relation to.
Honorable Senior Counsel, the observation made by the Honorable Attorney General to me is in order. The matter is in court, and I urge that you not pronounce on it at this time.
Mr. Speaker, the objection by the Attorney General is without merit. I bow to the ruling of the court, I bow to the ruling of the Speaker, but I wish to say, Mr. Speaker, that the DPP has charged for manslaughter.
Honorable Senior Counsel, and I bow to you, a charge is not a conviction. If you say it's
Mr. Speaker, I never said anyone was convicted.
No. So,
I said that a policeman shot Mr. Boston.
Please let
the
us
DPP has done the
stay
same
away
thing.
from this case in court. Thank you.
Rather than Guyana Police Force protecting Orrin Boston safely in his home, he was shot in his home, on his bed, next to his wife. Mr. Speaker, without explanation, months and months rolled by without a word from the Guyana Police Force. Maybe the Honorable Attorney General wishes to object to that also. The eventual institution of a charge of manslaughter against a policeman who allegedly would have shot and killed this man is not only an insult to the Boston family, but is a national embarrassment and disgrace. Mr. Speaker, what they want me not to say is what I have to say, and that we have returned to the dark days under the PPP civic regime. Guyanese under the PPP civic government, Mr. Speaker, have experienced not only the return of execution-style killings, but the rise of execution-style killings. This evidences the collapse of law and order and the rule of law. Between the 2nd of August 2020 and the 1st of September 2021, 12 persons were killed in execution-style killings. 12 persons. Still unresolved to the satisfaction of the Guyanese people and to the satisfaction of the families are the gruesome killings of the Henry Boys and Harris Singh. Despite statements made by the head of that administration sitting in front of us that he will leave no stone unturned to find the killers or to bring them to justice, to date this has not effectively happened to the satisfaction of all concerned. Mr. Speaker, the regime's utter disregard for the Constitution is manifest in its strident refusal to engage in the necessary consultations to ensure the confirmation of the Chancellor and Chief Justice of the Judiciary of Guyana. Mr. Speaker, despite calls from the judges of the Caribbean Court of Justice, including its president, the regime refuses to consult on the ground that it must be recognized. They say that it needs to be recognized. But the international community has begun to recognize and realize that this is the same dictatorial bunch from times past. Any consideration, Mr. Speaker, and I say this clearly, Mr. Speaker, any consideration on the constitution of the Judicial Service Commission must commence with consultations which lead to the confirmation of the Chancellor and the Chief Justice. They say that they have the highest respect for the constitutional independence of the judiciary. This is in the budget speech of the distinguished senior minister. Mr. Speaker, the regime has sought to undermine the constitutional independence of the judiciary by seeking to control their financial independence and autonomy. By Article 198 of the Constitution, both the Chancellor and the Chief Justice are members of the Judicial Service Commission, with the Chancellor being the chairman, Mr. Speaker. The regime's assault on the constitutional agencies and bodies, whether by seeking to demolish their financial independence as guaranteed by the Constitution on one hand, or on the other hand, to stultify the work of the commissions, particularly in the case of the Police Service Commission, was stoutly rebuffed by courts in judgments delivered by the courts. These attacks on the constitutional agencies represented serious attacks on the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to see Mr. Dharamlal, Honorable Member Dharamlal, has returned to the House. But I recall him voting, Mr. Speaker, according to the Hansard, in support of a Fiscal Management Accountability Amendment Act of 2021. That is because they were trounced in court by yours truly. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, it certainly appears that the case to be that the removal of the Police Service Commission, the increased political interventions by the regime, and the maintenance of an acting and not confirmed Commissioner of Police is to promote the use of the police force as an instrument of oppression against the Guyanese people. We call for the immediate confirmation of a Commissioner of Police. Mr. Speaker, the High Court has ruled that efforts to subjugate the Supreme Court, the judiciary, and other constitutional agencies to the People's Progressive Party by taking away their constitutionally guaranteed independence was unconstitutional.
Thank you, Honourable Member. We will need an extension for you to continue.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the honourable member be given 5 minutes to conclude his presentation.
Thank you, Honourable Chief Whip. Honourable Member, you can continue and conclude.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Ali government, the current government, seems incapable of operating and executing the Criminal Justice Sector Reform Program. Under the Criminal Justice Sector Reform Program, the guidelines, rules, and procedures for the implementation of a program of restorative justice had already been developed. The Restorative Justice Bill of 2019, drafted by our side, has been laid in this assembly. For 2 years, the Honorable Attorney General has done nothing, squat, nothing, zero, zilch, to implement the system of restorative justice. The Attorney General is doing his best to ensure that the benefits of the restorative justice program are denied to the Guyanese people. Benefits that would see defendants and victims benefiting from and being protected from the bureaucratic oppression and insensitivity, to ensure that defendants and victims are heard and treated fairly. I urge the Attorney General to cease providing to his government unconstitutional advice, cease to avoid being embarrassed in court, and to focus on implementing the projects for which billions of dollars are assigned to his ministry and nothing is done. The country would be better off, Mr. Speaker, if we have less Tuesday night activities and more work at the ministry. The budget speeches by the senior minister year after year, Mr. Speaker, offers nothing insightful on the regime's plans for the justice sector reform. The result is that billions of dollars are being spent purportedly on justice sector reform, and there is no result, is indicative of the lack of imagination or incompetence on the part of the Attorney General and the Minister of Legal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, the courts continue to be overwhelmed and incapable of addressing the mentally ill. Year after year, the Attorney General has abdicated his responsibility to introduce appropriate legislation supported by the necessary mechanisms to address this issue. We of the APTU AFC will ensure that mental health courts are established. Mr. Speaker, the budget speech fails to offer any solution to deal with the low levels of public confidence in the legal system. There will be no system or plan in place revealed by the senior minister to address any structured access, public access to legal information, legal access to civil and criminal representation. Mr. Speaker, I will shut my mouth if you will never ever ask me for my notes from law school again so that you could be educated today. You are ingrate. Mr. Speaker, in last year's budget speech, the senior minister stated that $1.2 billion was made available for courts at Port Kaituma, Maburum, and Vigilance. 1 year later, these courts are yet to be completed. Mr. Speaker, there is no evidence that economic freedom is being allowed to take hold in this country. What we see are attempts to keep Guyanese locked in a pattern of economic dependency, discrimination, and marginalization. Many local investors are being harassed and prevented from enjoying unbiased services from the government. Mr. Speaker, the country is at a difficult place and a problematic place. Mr. Speaker, the resources of this country can indeed be used for economic and social transformation. The small man in the towns, in the hinterland, in the villages are simply left to defend themselves. The greatest challenges, Mr. Speaker, to the economic and social transformation in this country lies in the regime's reluctance to embrace a culture of inclusivity and consultation, and in the commitment to trickle-down economics that support income inequality and poverty. Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, as Francis Bacon said in Novum Organum, it would be an unsound fancy and self-contradictory to expect things that have never yet been done can be done, except by means which have never been tried. Mr. Speaker, this budget is anti-family. It's given a small man nothing, nothing to survive on, nothing to live on, nothing to hope for. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Thank you, Honourable Member. It is now time for the Honourable Member, Minister of Housing, Colin Crowe, to make his presentation.